So, hello and welcome to the Psychophiles podcast. My name is Hugo, and I'll be leading the conversation today. I don't have Olivia nor Marshall today, as they are busy. However, I'm met by the wonderful Charlotte Lennox. We talked a little bit off mic about the kind of work she does, and so I'd love to get more into the specifics because she's a forensic psychologist, and we're all a little bit excited and a little bit puzzled by what it means to be a forensic psychologist and what it means to work in this field. So the first thing that I would like to ask you is just to give me a little bit of a rundown as to when you think about the prison system, when you think about doing research and trying to help prisoners in the prison system, what kinds of methods, what kinds of strategies do you try to apply to actually help prisoners?
So in terms of, I suppose if I talk about research designs and then the things that we then evaluate. So in terms of research designs, our research as a department, I would suggest is what you described is that true kind of mixed methods research. So we all want kind of robust empirical evidence around the effectiveness of interventions, and the kind of gold standard for that is usually randomized controlled trials. And we've got lots of experience delivering those types of evaluation designs. But in prison settings, they can be quite complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Much more complicated than, for example, running a kind of drugs trial in the community, which is where randomized control designs came from. When you then try and, I suppose, extrapolate that into a prison setting, which by its very nature is complex, and then that often what we're doing is trying to evaluate psychological interventions, where I suppose what you might describe as the black box of the core mechanisms of how interventions work. Psychological interventions aren't as well defined as a drug, for example, where you know exactly how it's going to make a difference.
Like you mentioned, for instance, the creative writing intervention.
Yeah, so that's a randomized control trial of creative writing intervention. And so you can imagine that how that works and how that produces an outcome is much more complex and obscure, and you're less able to see those changes really than if it was a drug trial. So what we tend to do is, if we are running a randomized control trial, we'll also have a really kind of thorough qualitative component to those trials to help us understand if we do find an effect or we don't find an effect, why that might be and how that's come about. And so our research is trial designs often, but then with qualitative methods. So those might be interviews, observations, looking at, for example, if it's a psychological intervention, we might be looking at the formulations that have been developed in those to then be able to see whether we can observe the impact of those formulations in terms of the delivery of the intervention. So
tell me a little bit more about, in particular, how you would create a study like that, because that's something that I'm really curious about. Let's just imagine a hypothetical scenario. You've got a prison, you've got some prisoners there, and you see that something's not right, and maybe there could be something that's improved. And for example, you come up with a hypothesis, maybe for adolescent inmates, it would be useful for them to do an intervention where they kind of describe maybe their feelings, maybe try to express themselves in some way. And that's kind of the idea behind that creative writing. So how do you come up with an idea like that? How does it come about?
They often come about in different scenarios, and I suppose it's understanding a little bit about how research is funded. I think is useful to kind of talk about. So our research is funded by lots of different funders. And there are some funders that allow you to develop what they call research-led.
Yeah.
So that would be completely the researcher's own design, the intervention that they want to evaluate. You've got kind of free reign. So you then submit that and it gets peer reviewed. And if the funders and the reviewers think that it's got real value, then they would fund it. Then there are other projects where, as a researcher, the funders might approach you with their initial idea.
Right.
And so the creative writing trial that's being delivered at the moment, that came about because it was a specific request from the funder.
Oh, I see.
So the funder of that study is the Youth Endowment Fund. And the Youth Endowment Fund exists from a very large pot of money that was provided to them from the Home Office, with the clear objective that over the course of this, I think it was a 10-year period for the Youth Endowment Fund in terms of their existence, that they would fund predominantly trial designs of a whole range of intervention types, with the main aim of trying to reduce violence in young people. So that's their main aim. And so how the Youth Endowment Fund approach their projects is that they first of all seek the intervention deliverer, and they fund them, and then they match you as an evaluation team with the team who deliver the intervention. So in this case, the Youth Endowment Fund had identified the National Literacy Trust as a charity who were already working in prisons. They were already delivering some types of creative writing interventions within the prison estate, but predominantly within the adult prison estate. So what they asked the National Literacy Trust to do was to adapt something that they already knew sort of worked in the adult prison estate, to then adapt it, to then deliver it with 15 to 18-year-olds in prison. And so we worked with the National Literacy Trust to think about how they might kind of alter what they were currently delivering to make it kind of more intensive, to focus on specific aspects. And we did a kind of 3 to 4 month program of work with the National Literacy Trust, where we developed a logic model. And so logic models are increasingly being used in lots of psychological intervention research to essentially plot out, or to kind of have a diagram of how an intervention produces its outcomes.
Oh, I see.
And so we worked with the National Literacy Trust to develop this logic model, which then gave us an indication as to what our outcome measures would be in a trial.
Just so I have an idea, what would a logic model like that look like?
So it has, I suppose, simple, or the most simple logic models would have an input. So they'd have like activities or resources that go into an intervention. So they could be things like, it could be the staff to deliver it, how the staff are trained to deliver it. It could be numbers of sessions. It could be what the content of the sessions are. So it's very kind of activity focused. And then it has essentially another column which then focuses more on how in combination do people use those activities to produce something. So it might be something like working in a particular way with young people supports building trust and rapport. And so that we know when they've built trust and rapport, then the young people are more likely to engage in the intervention. And so that then supports the production of the outcome, which might be a greater sense of well-being. It might be feeling more creative. It might be something around kind of boosting someone's self-esteem.
So that's really cool. So it seems like there's these intermediate mechanisms that you focus on. And I'm sure you link a lot of literature to yes, if we do 12 sessions instead of 6, that's going to have a much greater effect on, let's say, self-esteem, which in turn will have a likely effect on maybe some other outcome measures like recidivism.
Yes.
And that's kind of
and so then having a logic model provides that kind of map for an evaluation team to think, right, what do we need to look at when we're thinking about evaluating it? So what we look in for is, are the activities being delivered in the way that we think in terms of the logic model? That's how it works. So, for example, if we're saying we think 12 sessions of an hour per week in a group of this number of young people, that we've got a kind of metric that we can then, in evaluation, we can measure. And so if those sessions aren't being delivered or there's variability, we can try and understand, is that variability then having an impact on the rapport building, for example? But then equally, that logic model, it enables us then to think about what are the primary outcome measures and what are all the secondary outcome measures that we can think about. So, for example, in this intervention delivered by the National Literacy Trust, there's 12 sessions, and then at the end of those 12 sessions, there's a celebration event, and that's being recorded by National Prison Radio, which is a kind of national run radio station that they broadcast within the prison. So it's a kind of big celebration event, and we think, because some of the literature tells us, particularly around kind of desistance literature, that if you support people to kind of build that sense of community and that sense of that they've made a difference, but there's also an event where they can celebrate their achievements, and those achievements be celebrated with their family members or officers within the prison, or even within kind of community networks, that helps to support someone's essentially perception of themselves.
That's interesting.
To kind of move them away, perhaps, from viewing themselves as an offender into a kind of person who's got value, who's got worth, who's been able to kind of produce, and in this case, young people can produce poetry, they can write, they can do lyrics, they can present it however they want. But it gives them that kind of, it helps them change that self-identity. So what we're trying to do is observe that kind of change over time. And so the logic model, because it kind of maps everything out, it allows us to really make sure that we're in the data we're collecting, making sure that we're kind of capturing all the pieces of the jigsaw, that we can fit them together. And then if our primary outcome measure shows that there's a difference between our two groups, we can then look at all of this other data to think, is it this, is it that, which bit made the most important difference?
That's interesting. That's really, really interesting. Because I can imagine how that works on a number of levels, because first of all, human data is often complicated. So it's not like you change one thing and then something pops out on the other end. It's not like physics or chemistry, where the rules are very, very clear and there's just one thing that you can focus on. There's so many, it's multifactorial. That's kind of the motto of psychology, so to speak, that you can have self-esteem, you can have a ton of other things like physical activity, and all that can contribute to a sense of well-being, for instance. So there's these, it's really hard, I can imagine,
it is,
to really find, okay, this does this without, all these confounds which could obscure the results. I can imagine the difficulty of doing something like that. And the logic model seems like a perfect demonstration of how you can bridge those two, and like the complexity of it, and then still get some clear results that you can work with. So that's fascinating. And I also thought it was really sweet that you kind of think about, try to help prisoners get a better image of themselves. And that's kind of the goal of some of these interventions. Because I think that the public has a fairly skewed perception of how prisoners, what prisoners are like. So typically it's this, this outcast who doesn't play with society and doesn't want to reintegrate or doesn't want to, I suppose, improve themselves like everybody else does. And I think that kind of disputes that idea that that's not necessarily the case. It's just that they have a different set of circumstances, which makes it more difficult. So I wonder if, in the research that you're doing, you have the sense that, it is possible through the interventions that we're doing to bring prisoners to a more, I suppose, pro-social state where they can reintegrate into society, and you feel the hopefulness that is a possibility.
I think that's I think from anybody who works in kind of forensic psychology, forensic mental health, I think that that's the reason why we do the job that we do, is that we have a there's kind of quotes around around how we respond to prisoners and what prison looks like is a reflection of society. And I genuinely feel that as a society, we have to want the best for every population and every group. And prisoners, if we have a view that they have less worth, they have less value, that reflects on us as a society and not on them. And so, I think anybody who works in forensic psychology, our aim for all of this is kind of rehabilitation to support people who often haven't had the life chances that other people have had.
Right.
We know that people in prison are a highly vulnerable and highly marginalized group. Their experience of physical health conditions, mental health conditions, experience of real complex trauma and real kind of traumatic life events are much more frequent and than in comparison to the general population. So essentially, they are often dealt a combination of cards, if you will, that doesn't justify their response, if that makes sense. So there is still that response from society that we have a series of rules and there has to be a consequence for that. But it's around trying to understand why somebody might offend, why somebody might be violent, and we can only support somebody to move forward if we really understand why that happens and why that occurs. And so the need to develop interventions that provide, there's a therapeutic element. So there is around kind of psychological support, but there's also supporting people with a whole range of kind of life skills, supporting them to build kind of supportive networks around them in the community.
Right.
So some of our other prison trials that we've delivered within the adult prison estate have focused on that transition through the gate. And we know that transitions are really, really critical in people's lives. They can make things go really well, but they can also make things go horribly wrong if we get the transition wrong.
Right.
And we know that sometimes when people are released from prison, if they don't have any stable accommodation to go to, if they're not being plugged into kind of education training, or even re-engaging with their family, if that's something that's supportive for them, we know that if that doesn't happen, that the chances of them coming back into prison are really high. We know that those people who use substances, that then if those transitions aren't supported, then there's an increased risk of overdose and death within that kind of first 28, 30 days of release. So we know that that's really, really critical. And so, yeah, all of the research that we do is focused on trying to provide an evidence base so that we can develop robust interventions that support people from the point of admission into prison all the way through to their release and then into the community, in the hope that with all of these interventions and this support that we can support people to improve their well-being, to improve their kind of self-identity, to give them the skills and opportunities to desist from offending, and to, I suppose, reintegrate successfully back into community life. But one of the things that's interesting is that you said about that public perception is that most people who, there are some people who obviously their sentence lengths are very, very long. And some people may never be released from prison, but the vast majority of people who are in prison currently will be released and will be living in the community. And we need, as a society, to see that they aren't a different group. They're actually, they're part of our community. And so as a kind of society, we need to try and think about how we can kind of fix some of those. And it's not just, it's a kind of multi-level fixing of those things. So it's around kind of poverty and deprivation and access to services.
So there's these social components.
Exactly. Yes. It needs to be that kind of multi-level response.
Right. Because, for instance, I'd imagine that people who come from poverty, so if you come from even a certain neighborhood, then you can be much more likely to be admitted to a prison just by the mere fact that you're coming from a certain neighborhood in the first place, or that, maybe there's a higher prevalence of some kind of mental health issue, let's say bipolar, things like that. And all of that could somehow influence you to be more likely to go to prison. So that's really, really fascinating. One thing that I'm curious about, seeing that there's both, you kind of have this drive to help, because that's something that I found really, at first surprising, but then it made a lot more sense that forensic psychology isn't just about, trying to find who is the murderer and things that we typically associate with the word forensics. It's more about, doing a little bit of research, trying to actually understand why people get into these situations and kind of break apart and study the individual variables that might influence people to go to prison. And so I've been really fascinated by the fact that it's much different than what I thought. And so that made me wonder, from your experience, are there specific factors which seem to be especially key in a person being admitted to prison, and then factors which help them get out?
So I think in terms of forensic psychology, there's that perception, isn't there, that we attend crime scenes, or that we that it's about some sort of telepathic communication that you might have with a kind of serial, that's the most sensationalized kind of aspects of forensic psychology, whereas the reality is, in terms of what forensic psychologists do, and from our perspective in terms of researchers, it's a very similar kind of pathway in terms of what we're interested in. So as a forensic psychologist, you would be, first of all, wanting to understand through an assessment of what the risks are, what the needs are. You'd then develop a kind of understanding of how those risks and needs have kind of interacted with each other. So that interplay between factors to really try and understand why somebody might be violent or why an offence has occurred. Because if we can understand the factors that kind of precipitated an event, so the things that happened before, the things that led up to it, in either kind of longer term or those immediate triggers, if we can understand that, we can then intervene in that, because we can then understand why it's likely to happen, in what scenarios might it happen in the future, so that we can try and mitigate that. It doesn't mean that we'd ever be able to kind of minimize risk completely, but we can try and reduce that risk. And in a similar way, that's what we do as researchers. We think about the hypothesis. So we're trying to think about what's the question, what do we want to answer, and then we're trying to understand how best can we answer that question. So what methods can we use? And then in both cases, what we're doing is delivering something and then evaluating to see whether it works. So actually, it's a very similar kind of process that we do. And in terms of, I suppose, thinking about that understanding, I think that's the key of understanding how particular factors relate to each other. So a real common one is, we know, and I've said before, people in prison, their rates of mental health are much higher. But actually, in terms of the research, there isn't that complete linear relationship between mental health and offending.
I see.
Because there are lots of people who struggle with their mental health but don't offend. So it's trying to understand what is that interplay. And often it is that mental health risk with other risk factors that in combination increases the risk of offending. It's not just that, well, you've got that, so that means that's going to happen. It doesn't.
So there's some interactions between
it's understanding that complex interaction, but there are factors that are I suppose much more common. And we know that from there's a series of kind of longitudinal kind of birth cohort studies where they followed people from birth all the way through. And a lot of that developed our understanding of kind of developmental offending. So thinking about what happens in terms of adolescence. And there was lots of, I think the most well-known is that by Terry Moffat, where she, from their longitudinal study, they identified two distinct groups of adolescents. Those young people who are antisocial or might offend, but that's limited just to adolescents. And then there is another group who their antisocial behaviour tends to start earlier. It tends to go on for longer, and they called that group the life course persistent. And within that group, they were more likely to experience poor mental health, poor experience of education, often exclusions. They tended to have a antisocial peer group in a similar way that the adolescent limited group may also be associating with kind of peers who are also involved in antisocial behaviour, but it looked different. That group,
the peer group was different.
The peer group tends to be different, and they're more likely to drift into, I suppose, more organised crime groups versus, I suppose, just adolescents who are kind of throwing stones, that kind of just high kind of risk behaviour. And But they've also identified within this life course persistent group that there are executive functioning differences. There's been lots of
higher impulsivity.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a combination of all these things that makes this group whose offending tends to persist for longer. That there are specific risk factors for that group. But I suppose the thing to say, that doesn't mean that everybody in that group looks like that, but lots do.
Yeah.
So those longitudinal studies are really, really useful because they're actually the most robust evidence that we've got around risk factors, and all of the risk assessment tools that forensic psychologists use, like the HCR20 to assess violence risk. All of the risk factors within those were developed from the evidence base on those longitudinal studies, because we know that those risks are important. And then it's the job of a forensic psychologist in that formulation to look at those different risk factors and understand how they all fit together for that individual, because we know that those risk factors for one individual, you might have two individuals with very similar risk factors, but actually the interplay of those is quite different.
I see.
And so that's the role of the formulation, or that shared understanding, to understand how everything fits together.
That's interesting. So it's, in some ways, it's almost like you break it down into those factors and you see how they then predict, when combined together in different combinations, how they then predict whether someone will, say, go to prison or won't go to prison. And so in that way, you determine the risk and the required resources that you need to dedicate to them. So that was something that I found really fascinating, because I've been doing a little bit of research of my own via the essay that we've been writing as part of the second year forensic psychology course. And I found it really fascinating how very structured it is. You've got the risk, the need, the responsivity model, which kind of funnels prisoners through a set of procedures that help them understand, that help the forensic psychologist and the prison system understand, okay, how likely is it that this prisoner, given their previous criminogenic variables, how likely are they to reoffend, or how likely they are to need some more serious kind of intervention. And I found it really fascinating how structured it is, and also that we still haven't quite adopted it throughout the whole prison system. And it seems silly that we wouldn't do that quite so fully. So I'm curious, in your case, when you think about how the prison system is working right now, in the UK specifically, are there some big ideas, some big implementation strategies that we aren't doing yet, which you think that we should be doing, given your understanding of the literature?
Oh, it's a really good question, that one. So if I think in response, if we deal with it in two parts, one around, I suppose, using risk assessment tools and how that's used, and then around, I suppose, other factors. So in terms of risk assessment tools, the vast majority of them all originated from the US or Canada. That tends to be where the bulk of the research has come from. And we've got a whole raft of risk assessment tools, predominantly over, I suppose, we've got what we call kind of different generations of risk assessment tools. So first generation risk assessment tools were all completely unstructured, completely up to clinical discretion around how you assess risk factors. And clearly one of the challenges is that it lacks reliability. So one professional doing an assessment might look very different from somebody else. And so
So they are very subjective, not very effective
Yes.
at actually doing what they're supposed to.
And so then we have the second generation, which is essentially a complete shift in the other direction to what are called kind of actuarial measures, which are number-based, very fixed risk factors, which tend to all be historical. So things that have happened previously. So number of offences committed, number of violent offences, age at which you committed your first offence. So real kind of static historical factors. In terms of the research evidence, they've actually, in terms of pure prediction, for predicting what happens in a large group of people, they're actually fairly accurate. But because they're so static and all focused on things that have happened in the past, they're not very forward thinking. So they're also quite negative.
I see, yeah.
And so then there was a shift into the third generation, which is kind of a hybrid between unstructured and structured. It has structure, but it has flexibility, and that's called structured professional judgement. And that's where tools like the HDR20, they sit. So they are risk factors that you would rate based on the evidence of from that individual as to whether that risk factor is present, and then is it relevant?
Yeah.
And then you'd use that information to then develop a formulation. But that formulation has got some level of subjectivity, but based on your kind of professional knowledge of the person who you're writing that formulation for. And then the fourth generation are those risk need responsivity assessments. And they often have actuarial elements.
Yeah.
So elements that you would rate the risk or rate the need. And then you'd have a case management section, which then allows you to think about that risk, that need, and then match that to a level of how you're going to respond. So, for example, if somebody was to score 25 out of 30, then they'd be in the maybe high risk group, and you know that in the high risk group, your response needs to look like this.
Right.
So those are the different types of assessments that we use. As I mentioned, they're much more frequently used in particularly the structured professional judgment and the risk need responsivity tools, much more widely used in the US and Canada. In the UK, within forensic services, so when I talk about forensic services, those are the hospital settings.
Yeah.
So those are the high secure, medium secure, and low secure services that are either delivered by the NHS or private providers. And those are for people who have a diagnosis that reaches the threshold for under the Mental Health Act, but they're also that either had been in prison and been transferred from prison to hospital, or at court identified with a mental health condition and went to hospital rather than prison. So, and in those hospital settings, structured professional judgment tools like the HDR20 are essentially mandatory, so everybody would have one. Within the prison system, we don't. So structured professional judgment tools will be used, but that's at the discretion of the forensic psychologist. It's not kind of mandatory. Within the prison settings in the UK, they use a tool called Oasis. And that, I suppose, most looks like an R&R tool. So it assesses their risk, and then it supports the offender manager to develop a plan for either what happens in terms of their time in prison. So it might be what offending behaviour interventions are offered to them to meet that risk. Or then what will happen in terms of the community when they're under licence, under probation. So So that's what we use in the UK. Interestingly, there's been a recent systematic review of R&R. And again, it's there's lots of research in prison and forensic settings, but often they struggle with a lack of robustness. Some of that is because the gold standard of what is robust is a randomized control trial. And as we said, they're really complex, they're really expensive to do. And so sometimes they're delivered, but might not be as robust as they could be. But the most recent systematic review around R&R has suggested that there are some issues with the R&R literature. It tends to be dominated by the authors of R&R. And while that isn't inherently biased, there is a risk that where you've got the authors of a particular tool or a particular approach heavily involved in all of the evidence around it, they're quite likely to find that it's effective.
It might also be more difficult to generalize because they might have a certain way of doing things that other people just won't be able to implement, even if they tried. So they might not have that, let's say, expert awareness. And so then that makes it less likely to be generalizable, which in turn makes it less useful for people who would use it, say, in the UK rather than the US or Canada. And
then there has been the review also highlighted that there was some kind of concerns around not being completely transparent about funding for the studies. And then the big caveat of all the studies that were included in the systematic review were all rated as quite poor quality. So while there seems to be lots of evidence around the usefulness of R&R, actually some of that isn't as robust as it could be.
I see.
And so this recent systematic review, I think it was published last year, indicates that we need much more evidence in different populations, in different countries, and that evidence to be as removed from the authors of the R&R approach as possible, just to provide that real independent evaluation.
Of course. That makes sense. One thing that when I was doing my own research into R&R specifically, I also read somewhere, and tell me if that agrees with your understanding of how the UK system implements R&R, that that prisoners under 12 months, typically, they have less likelihood of even getting the Oasis assessment because they're in shorter, and I think there's a lot of delays in how they're implemented. So then you have a lower likelihood that they'll actually get the assessment, which in turn means that they'll have a lower likelihood of getting any sort of treatment for it. And most of them don't actually get treatment for it. And that kind of leads to that revolving door system where they come out of prison not having gained any resources that would help them reintegrate, kind of like we talked about earlier, which in turn means that they go back into the prison system because that's their only way of, let's say, earning money or kind of coping with life. So given that, is that kind of how you... have you seen this kind of pattern, or is that like a mistaken impression of mine?
No, it's true. And I think it's useful to understand that in the context, I suppose, of the justice system in its entirety, as in the UK, the justice system is I suppose it's a political hot topic. And what we tend to find is that when there is a shift from one government to another, who have a different approach to criminal justice policy, we see things change. And so in terms of thinking about particularly short sentenced prisoners, so for those who are sentenced to 12 months and under, I can't remember exactly, but maybe about 10 years ago, there was the government decided to break up the National Probation Service. So prior to that, anybody who was released from prison who would be supervised under probation, regardless of level of risk, would have been covered by the probation service.
Yeah.
The caveat being that those who are serving a sentence of under 12 months were generally not included in that group. So that does increase that revolving door. And then what happened is the establishment of community rehabilitation companies. So these were private companies set up to essentially take the low and medium risk people away from the National Probation Service, and that they would manage in the community the lower risk people. And the National Probation Service would continue to supervise and manage those who were kind of high and very high risk. I think it's fair to say that was an utter disaster.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And so what happened a couple of years ago is that these private companies who were supervising low and medium risk were basically abolished, and everybody went back under the supervision of the probation service. Alongside this, we've had, I suppose, years and years of kind of austerity measures, which have particularly affected, I suppose, nationally run services. So a social care system, an education system, and a justice system is one. So alongside that, they've had massive cuts in staffing. And so there is the context of the justice system is that it's massively under-resourced, it's massively understaffed, and often the staff that they do have are relatively new, not as experienced, because a lot of the really well-experienced, well-established staff either left or were very expensive to keep. So were left.
Austerity measures.
Yes, exactly. So there's been a shift in the staffing, both in prisons and in probation. So yes, you have some real gaps in it, and in particular, short sentence prisoners are of particular concern because the staffing shortage is often in prison. Their access to offending behaviour interventions might be more limited because they're not there for very long.
Right.
So, for example, if somebody only has a 6-month sentence, but there is a waiting list for accessing the offending behaviour intervention, there's a risk that they are released before that's been able to be delivered to them. And then with limited supervision in the community and limited things put in place for them, you can kind of see how quite easily that kind of can lead into that kind of revolving door. So there are, when you asked before about what's the, I suppose, the big kind of issues, I think one of the things we would say is the level and the quality of staffing over, particularly post-COVID, is very different than what it was pre-COVID, and that in itself causes lots of challenges.
Right. I've read some research that R&R interventions, which are implemented by a professional psychologist, can lower rates of recidivism by like 20-30%. It's ridiculous how much that is. And then you kind of pair that with the amount of money lost when someone who gets out of prison goes back into prison. I think the statistics for the UK are like 18 billion pounds per year for the whole group of prisoners who then go back to prison. That's the community cost, including like theft and all the costs of just maintaining the prisoner once they come back. So to me, it's really quite ridiculous that we would see something like that and we still have those problems. And there's this one other statistic which I really found quite interesting. I think it was the Washington Economics Policy Institute. I don't know how exactly they order those words, but they found that if you actually implement those kinds of interventions fully, like if you implement them and pay for staffing, which is required to do, say, an R&R intervention, then that actually saves money.
Mm-hmm.
So that consistently saves money. I think in the US, that study was done in the US because Washington, they found that it was, I think, $4,000 saved per prisoner, which just seems like, surely if we want to improve some things in the government and save some money for people, then that's something that we would do. But there just seems to not be enough motivation to change it yet. So I'm curious if, as part of your work as a forensic psychologist, you also try to address these more broader social issues, and if there's some ways that people or yourself can kind of try to make a difference in that regard on a bigger scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so completely. So if prison is expensive, and so we know that has to be the last resort because it is so expensive. We know that we can deliver interventions in the community, and for those people on community sentences, that their outcomes generally are better.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you look at the reoffending kind of rates for different groups, those people who have ever been in prison, their reoffending rate is the highest of any
Mm-hmm.
group. Interestingly, the population in custody with the highest reoffending rate is for young people, so the 15 to 18-year-olds. Time again, if those young people go into custody, go into prison, their reoffending rate is way higher than the adult prisons as well. So I think that says something about where we need to target our interventions, and to either reduce, which they have been doing, reducing the number of first-time entrants into the criminal justice system for young people and those young people in custody. So when I did my PhD, the population of young people in prison in the UK was about 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
It's now about 450.
Oh, wow.
So a massive reduction. And there's been some real successes around youth offending teams and youth justice services, and a real focus on diversion activities to try and divert young people. But what we haven't seen that in, I suppose, the adult estate,
right.
whereas that reduction in numbers. So that's a real kind of success story.
Mm-hmm.
But when we think about that, I suppose trying to understand that kind of reoffending, and I suppose what we do as academics, the research, I think, research can't sit within universities. Like we can't have these like ivory towers of kind of academics kind of contemplating kind of like real life kind of problems, but not actually then reaching out to actually make a difference. And that's the bit.
It can't be too theoretical.
Exactly. And so how we do that is we work really closely with the prisons, that if we're running a project in a prison, then we'll kind of have real kind of open dialogue and communications with the governor around what the research means and about the impact. And we might do kind of a feedback to the kind of staff teams, but that's on a kind of individual level where we can then start to make a difference. And I suppose the university is really supportive of that, is that the university, you might have heard of it, I've got a policy team, so policy at Manchester, and they are really, really useful, and they've been incredibly helpful in linking particularly us with MPs who are tabling questions around the justice system,
Right.
and matching our research with kind of topics that are being discussed in Parliament as a way of trying to link us as kind of academics and researchers in with the people who make those decisions.
Right.
And so I've had a number of meetings. It seems to have been particularly since the change of government, much more active around the justice system and questions for the justice system. And that's quite interesting for a whole host of reasons as to why it's become a particular hot topic at the moment. But it has. And so the policy team at the university have kind of linked us up, and we've had a number of meetings with MPs to kind of share our research, and then for them to try and think about how they use that research to either ask questions, like table questions for discussions in Parliament, or for them to use it as kind of evidence. And
so in some ways you're educating the government to help them make an informed decision.
Because a lot of the time as academics, what we will do is we will write things in peer-reviewed journals.
Right.
But we need to think about the readership of those journals, and
that's other academics.
Well, it is other academics. Yes, exactly.
You can solve all the world's problems, but no one will know about it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's around how we then translate that academic research, which is important and does it improves things in terms of our research methods and our research designs and our approaches, and it advances our theory. But what's the real life translation into practice? And so that's where the policy team have been really, really helpful in helping us do that.
And I can imagine that in some ways, even on a purely scientific, taking it from a purely scientific perspective, the ultimate test of a theory is if it works in an applied context. So if you have the best sounding theory in the world and you make the best acronym for it, that spells something out, like a reasonable word, like ocean for some research and things like that. Then if it then proceeds not to work, then that's it for the theory. There's no point in holding on to it. So I can definitely appreciate why there'd be, and also as an academic, even as a purely academic, using a purely academic thought process, how that would be very important and kind of part of the job, so to speak. Yeah, so that sounds really, really interesting. And kind of focusing a little bit on that aspect as well. So you have, so you've got this academic side, but you also have this applied psychology part that kind of helps implement the different interventions and the different theories that you've been learning about. So when you look at your job, do you kind of see yourself more as, I should be out there helping MPs understand things, or do you see yourself more as an academic? I want to learn about what the actual mechanisms are, and maybe every now and again I can help inform, but my focus is more on the actual theory, the actual science.
A bit of both. I would probably say I'm more towards the applied side. So one of the things that I'm interested in particular is implementation theory. So understanding how, if we develop an intervention, how then we can implement that in real world scenarios, because
I suppose the logic model would,
and the logic model really helps with that. So again, I can give you another example of another project at the moment, which is a kind of collaboration led by the University of Huddersfield, but I'm kind of leading one of the kind of work packages within that project, and that's it's developed a kind of one-to-one intervention for young people who are in contact with substance use services, and it's working in a slightly different not too dissimilar to what the service was already doing. It's developing a much more formulaic way of working, and essentially developing a bit more structure. So, as we've talked about, an assessment, a formulation. It's not called a formulation; we call it shared understanding. So, with the worker and the young person around that young person's substance use, what their goals are, what they want to focus on, and then developing a kind of plan of how they were going to work together to support that young person to either use less of the substances, stop using one, whatever the young person wants to focus on. And at the moment, we're kind of testing the intervention, and our next step is how we've delivered it so far is that essentially the research team. So us, we've developed the training, we delivered the training, we have essentially sourced the supervision framework for the workers. We've essentially put everything in place for them and said, right, you deliver this and see how it goes. But we know going forward, we are going to have to step back, and that substance use service is going to have to take on the training of their own staff. It's going to have to in-house the supervision and so essentially it can be rolled out. And that's the bit that I'm really interested in, is trying to understand how we move from, because it's linked to what you were saying before. We've got lots of evidence sometimes that interventions work, but they work in really well-controlled trial environments where the research team have been on everything going, that's not, we need to make sure that everything's rigid and delivered in exactly the same way. And then what happens is you have an intervention that you've got an effectiveness for, but then when you try and deliver that within the context of often the chaos of a prison or the criminal justice system, with
or understaffing
or practitioners who their priorities are different. Then we know that the implementation is affected by that, and when the implementation of something is affected, it impacts the outcomes. So I'm really interested in how we shift from moving the evidence base from quite controlled environments into that real world, because that's the bit that is then going to lead to that real change. If services can deliver something that works for them and we know is effective, then that's the kind of the key, really. And so I'd say a bit of both. I'm interested in the theory, but I think for us as a department, and definitely for me, it's very much around it has to have that real world impact and kind of application.
Right. That makes complete sense. And that's kind of what I find the most interesting about forensic psychology. So I appreciate that we resonate on where the focus or where the interest is for me, is the sense that, we can actually make a difference if we implement it correctly, or if we find the right ways to communicate things to people. Then there's some way of maybe expanding the common welfare. So that's something that I really, really enjoy thinking about and then trying to actually implement in practice. And so with that, I was kind of curious, seeing how things are progressing right now, what's kind of the most promising, in your view, what's the most promising area that the prison system and maybe different interventions could be applied to help prisoners? So what do you think is kind of the hot area in this field right now?
I think there's a few. I think in the community we've got lots of evidence that CBT based interventions work. We've got lots of evidence. we've got increasing evidence, and actually lots of the offending behaviour interventions are based on CBT principles. We know that there is, again, evidence that they work in a similar way for those people in prison settings. But I think we know that they don't work for everybody. And I think that's where we need to move more with our understanding of psychological interventions in particular. Is yes, we might have evidence that they work, but they don't work for everybody. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there is something around that individual that means it doesn't work. It's often the case that as forensic psychologists, we need to be much more open about the way in which we deliver things may not work for particular people. So again, thinking CBT works very well for people who might be neurotypical, but anybody who isn't, that then there may trying to understand thoughts, feelings, behaviours can be a bit more challenging. And so that's not that it doesn't work. It means that the challenge is for us to work to adapt interventions so that they work for more people. So I think moving that way is one area. Linked to the trial that we're delivering at the moment for young people, there is increasing evidence that I suppose the potential for kind of arts-based or sports interventions in prisons are particularly useful. So there is some evidence that kind of music interventions or kind of theatre interventions, that those real creative have the opportunity to be much more inclusive than I suppose more formal education. We know lots of people in prison have really struggled with what might be deemed as kind of formal education, so kind of having to sit down and do homework and all those types of things can be a real barrier. But actually there is opportunities for learning and expression through arts based. So I think that's another area. I think the other is around, and there is quite a lot of literature on this, but I think much more understanding about the impact that kind of staff and I suppose policies and the impact that has on people, and also that, I suppose, related to that, the prison environment. So the prison environment in the UK, we've got an aging population of prisoners, but we've also got a increasingly aged and decaying infrastructure. So we've got lots of prisons that are Victorian prisons, which doesn't support anybody who might have kind of mobility issues. Often some prisons still have those kind of old metal spiral staircases from kind of one landing to the other. So we've got prison environments that are often not clean, loud, hot, cold in the winter. So understanding that the environment that people are in massively affects their mood, massively impacts relationships with staff, and so I think there is a need to understand much more about the impact of the environment, and how we might, importantly, what we might do about that. How do we change that environment to make it much more supportive of somebody's well-being, both for, I suppose, both the prisoners and for the staff, because often the staff spend 12 hours a day, if not longer, in there, so it also impacts on them as well.
Right. Well, that makes complete sense. That makes complete sense, and I think that's a great point. to finish on. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Charlotte Lennox, everybody. Thank you again. I'd be happy to continue this conversation at another point. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Fantastic.